Everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Kyle Kim Hayes, and I'm head of marketing at Pollfish. We are a leading do-it-yourself market research platform. And today we are going to be speaking with Mischa Fisher. Mischa is the chief economist at Angi Inc., which includes the brand Angi, formerly known as Angie's List, and Home Advisor, powered by Angi. Now, if by some strange chance you are not familiar with the name Angi, and Angi does not ring a bell, Angi has been a partner for every homeowner and every part of the home care journey for the past 25 plus years, and has helped over 150 million people and has a network of nearly 250,000 professionals as well. So Mischa, you have an absolutely amazing title. I'm wondering if we can start by having you talk about what your day-to-day activities look like in your areas of responsibility.
Sure, thanks. Great to be with you, Kyle. Looking forward to the conversation. The chief economist role can really vary company to company. At some companies, it's strictly a public-facing role, looking at what the market's doing, looking at what's going on with consumers and supply chains and pricing and that sort of thing. At other companies, it can be completely internal. It can be completely focused on statistical inference, trying to find causation and experimentation and making sure that the analytics functions are sort of following best practices. I'm very fortunate. My role is sort of a blend of both. So the day-to-day can sometimes be involved in looking at internal challenges that we're working on in terms of driving insights, and other days it is strictly public-facing, where we want to make sure we're giving back to the marketplace of ideas in terms of helping people understand this big market that we play a role in.
And it's an absolutely amazing job, and I'm wondering if you would mind sharing a little bit about your background, so that for those people who are wondering how you ended up with such a cool role.
Sure. So before this, I was the chief economist for the state of Illinois, which was much more of an internal focused role, looking at making sure that our tax incentives and labor force training and regulatory regime around licenses and permits and that sort of thing were not creating distortions or inefficiencies in the market, and trying to make sure that the state policy really worked for everybody. And then before that, I actually spent about 10 years in Washington, D.C. working for the Congress. So if people have opinions on Congress, they can feel free to throw things at me later. But I spent about 10 years there working on infrastructure, science, and financial policy.
You may have just triggered an avalanche of questions in the open forum Q&A afterwards. But
for better or for worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys have some exciting things going on right now in terms of the Angi brand. Would you like to talk about that for a minute or two, so that people have a full understanding of the context that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. So as for anybody who doesn't know, we just rebranded Angie's List to Angi. I think that better reflects what we do now. Obviously, the market has changed a lot over the last 25 years. It's no longer just a list. The Angie's List brand is one that I think everybody knows and loves and recognizes as being a very helpful partner for both consumers and professionals in terms of navigating the marketplace and understanding what things cost. But as we transition into providing people with more pre-booked services and more at your fingertips one-click solutions, that the Angi brand sort of better captures that home for everything home that we're working on becoming.
And as part of that everything at your fingertips, one-stop kind of shop, you also produce an annual report, to which I understand you've diversified. First of all, can you talk to us a little bit and tell us a little bit about what the intent of your annual reports are and who you're targeting in terms of an audience? Yeah,
so the way that we try and really make sure that we're both for our own edification and our own understanding, as well as for everybody else in the marketplace, understanding what's going on. We've traditionally done a true cost report, where we've looked at pricing and what's going on in the marketplace. And the audience is really everybody for these. The goal is to make sure that, obviously, in terms of the news media and the public press, that reporters have good quality, robust research at their fingertips to understand what's going on, and that we're making that freely available. But it's also very helpful for consumers in terms of understanding what you should expect to be paying. Why is it that if you were exploring a project last year and this year, you might be having a different experience? And then also for professionals, because they're skilled craftspeople and tradespeople who do so much of the work in the marketplace. it's not like they're going to be spending their time focusing on market research and tracking pricing behaviors and supply chain issues and all these sorts of things. So for them, it's very helpful to be able to sort of pick up and at a glance understand and contextualize what's going on in the market that impacts them and their livelihoods. So we've traditionally done the true cost report, and we've been in the process of expanding out that research as well.
Right, I was going to go there next. The report has actually become so useful that you've recently started publishing 4 different reports, and all of them, I'm sure, will continue to be cited regularly in media. But can you tell us what the focus of each of those reports are?
Yeah, so in the first quarter, we release our pricing report so that people have a sense of over the last year how pricing has changed. So if you suddenly notice that your kitchen remodel you're getting higher or lower quotes, this helps contextualize that for what's going on with the pricing for those projects. So we picked the 20 most common projects and put out that report in the first quarter in terms of what's going on with pricing. Then in the second quarter, we look at what the overall market is doing. And that's an important distinction that I think we can talk about a little bit later when we transition into the financial markets. But the quick version is when you're looking at what's going on in a marketplace, just because prices rise, it doesn't necessarily mean that the market grew by the same amount. It might have grown more, it might have grown less, depending on how consumers and pros respond to that. So if prices for something go up by 50%, people might cut their spending on it by 60%, in which case your market shrunk. Or vice versa. You could have prices go down by 10% and then people increase their spending by 20% and now the market grew. So despite the lower prices. So in the second quarter, we look specifically at what's going on in the market itself, which is separate from spending and prices. Then in the third quarter, we look at what's going on in the pro world. We just released that report last week. So if anybody's curious about what's going on in the skilled trades, job satisfaction, recruitment, training, digital adoption, all of these things that are driving home construction, remodeling, maintenance and repair, all of the work that's being done on the 140 million plus residential structures we have in the country. That's our deep dive into look at what's going on in the labor force. And in the fourth quarter, we look at consumers. That's sort of closing out the year. We've got past the peak summer spending season, and it's a look at what consumers are doing in terms of what they just completed and then what they're expecting for the coming year following that experience. So that's our 4-part look at the entire market overall. So we look at pricing first quarter, market size second quarter, pros and the labor supply third quarter, and then consumers in the fourth quarter.
Well, you certainly have a full plate, don't you? When you think about putting out these reports, what kinds of platforms or tools do you use as you conduct your research and while you're putting these reports together?
We use a variety of tools. Obviously, Pollfish is a big part of one of the tools that we have that we want to make sure we use fully. It allows us to get a very good sense of what's going on in the general population, both for tradespeople and consumers, which is 2 important parts of that. On top of that, we also use a pretty standard data science toolkit in terms of the SQL, R, Excel, those sorts of things where we perform the analysis, look at what's going on, do inferential statistics on trying to attribute what are the drivers, and then sometimes look at forecasting where we plot out what we can sort of expect in the year or 2 to come based on the past trend.
Cool. So are there any advantages that a platform like Pollfish, a do-it-yourself DIY platform, provides? And I should also throw in, so that I at least appear objective, if there are any challenges as well, please feel free to share those as well.
That's fair. So Pollfish, we've been very happy with as a platform. That's obviously why we're here talking to everybody. I think I certainly provide my strong personal endorsement of the product. The biggest benefit is speed. We can generate things very quickly. That's not to say that there isn't a role for other methods of data collection, but I don't think that anybody else can come close to the speed of a do-it-yourself platform like Pollfish. The cost is also very competitive, I think, with, if you're looking at a cost per response rate, it is very competitive with other options in the marketplace. And, Pollfish in particular, those are sort of the general benefits. Pollfish in particular, the features that I particularly enjoy are the replicate weights that come in with the microdata. So for any researchers that actually want to get more than just the top lines or more than just the crosstabs, if you want to actually look at the microdata, having those replicate weights are very helpful, and they're just built right into it. as well as getting demographic characteristics without having to ask about it. That's another nice feature that saves you room. And in terms of drawbacks, I mean, I think everybody just has to be very cognizant with any tool when you're using it that you understand the implications of how you're using it, right? You can get yourself into some danger if you misuse tools and aren't aware that you're misusing it. So for any companies that are considering it, if you're somebody who's listening and are thinking about doing this and aren't familiar with survey design yourself, you want to make sure that you've got somebody on staff who can sort of watch and make sure that you're following best practices, that your weighting and your sampling are accurate, and that you're being very intentional about your survey design and question and answer structure.
Makes complete sense. So as a variety of different projects hit your desk and you start looking at them, how do you think about the kinds of tools, because there's a wide spectrum of options available to you, right? You can engage a Kantar or a Gartner on one end of the spectrum, or do it or conduct your research through a DIY platform like Pollfish. When you think about how to approach these different projects and what kinds of tools you'd bring to bear as you conduct that research and begin working your way through the project, what are the things that you take into consideration when you decide which tools and which services to bring to bear?
That is a wonderful question. The quick version is, if your budget allows it, people should use all of the tools, right? You want to sort of perform a signals intelligence type approach where you recognize that the truth is very hard to find, and you want to have as many different angles on it as possible so that you can triangulate in the middle what it is. And so we do use other providers as well from time to time. I think the big benefit, again, with Pollfish, though, relative to some of the other options, is speed. You can do it yourself faster, and it is certainly more cost competitive than lots of the sort of big name brand vendors that are out there. And so one has to sort of say, if I'm paying 4 or 5 times as much per response, am I getting a better panel, yes or no? And I don't think that's always the case. I think that there might be some very, very specific niche reasons why you might try, if you have a very, very specific subgroup of people you're trying to find and poll, that's probably where they shine a little bit more. Or if you've got so much budget that you're invariant, you're neutral on the price differences, then just roll them in as well as another tool set. And then also, if you're not that sensitive to speed, if you want to understand something, but you're not worried, if your company's not moving so quickly that you need to worry about the decision having already been made months before you ever get your survey results, if you're at a more we'll say tempered in the movement of your company direction, where you can wait a few months for results on a niche subgroup, then I think those are fine options. But when you're trying to do something that's real time and you're sensitive to the speed, and you are not convinced that the panels are any better quality in terms of when you're out there looking for people, then I think the DIY platforms are a very, very strong and compelling option, and probably should be people's first choice.
I would imagine that with all the turbulence we've seen, both in the economy and the world in general, that speed becomes slightly more important. Is that a fair assessment from your point of view?
Yes, things change very, very quickly. I mean, if you got results in February of 2020, they were irrelevant by the end of March. So it's one of those things where you have to re-benchmark these things, because I think unfortunately we live in a very, very rapid news cycle with things that are constantly changing, and that has an impact on how consumers see the world. And so if you want to understand things quickly, you need to constantly be tapping into that sentiment.
Absolutely, I agree. So we've been talking up to this point about the state of market research, so to speak, at Angi now, with your annual reports, your 4 annual reports as the capstones, if you will, that are one of the major outputs from all the research that you and your team are doing. Now I'd like to pivot a little more to the looking ahead front and what could be done. For example, customer lifetime value is something that a concept that's been around for a long time, and it's used by many companies as a key factor when they begin thinking about long-term strategic planning. But the thing about customer lifetime value is that it seems to me that it's kind of a rear view mirror kind of concept because it uses historical data to end up as part of its formula and to calculate what that customer lifetime value is. Is that a statement that you would agree with generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think all metrics, and this is something that, I moonlight as an instructor at Northwestern, and one of the things I try and remind my students is metrics are great, but they're imperfect. There's no such thing as the perfect metric. Everything can give you a bit of information, but don't ever rely on one thing for everything. Customer lifetime value can be a very useful indicator of a certain set of information, which is looking back. If I take the value of a customer and their average tenure and I put them together, I can get a rough sense of how that moves. But if you think about the standard disclaimer, when people talk about equities or portfolio performance, right? Past performance is not indicative of future performance. And that's the same thing with consumers, right? Just because that was the observed tenure and the observed spending that you saw a year or 2 or 3 ago, that doesn't mean that that's what you can expect in the future. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. It also doesn't necessarily control for the composition of consumers, right? You might miss that in the context of looking at what tenure and value are if you're not paying attention to what your mix of the people who are spending those things are. And so something like real-time market research, you can get a better sense of how all these things behave and get a richer view of the world when you combine a forward-looking look at what consumers are expecting, what they're thinking about things, what their expectations are, and fit that into your existing paradigm over the much more accounting approach of just looking at what are they spending, how long are they there, right? That's very much an empirical, what do we know thing. But where market research fits in is you can get into the what don't we know, what's likely to happen. And I think that gives you a much richer view of the world.
And probably better articulated calculations because it includes a range of possibilities and possible future outcomes, right?
Right, exactly. That is such an important part of understanding it because, and this is also a sort of a sidebar that people need to remember about averages, right? Averages are useful. If you look at average spending and average tenure, that tells you something. But you could have a bunch of, if you had 2 sets of consumers and one, they all were on your platform for 3 years. The other one, a bunch were on there for let's say 1 year, and then one was on there for 10 years. In both cases, you could have an average tenure of 3 years, but those are 2 very different scenarios. And you would miss that if you're looking at that narrower view of just the averages. And that's the other reason why you want to fit these things into sort of a richer view of the world.
Right. So now let's see if we can flesh this out into a little more concrete kind of example for our audience here. So Angi.com says in one of your reports that the average homeowner spends $8,305 per year on home improvements. Do you think that regular ongoing tracker type surveys where you ask people on a regular basis to measure their spend expectations might be useful in updating the customer lifetime value?
Yeah, potentially. That is, I think every company, you're going to have to think differently about how you do it. But I think fitting in that consumer general population view can be really, really important to contextualizing your internal financial metrics around what you're seeing among your consumers. So in our case, that 8,000 that's not the view of the Angi consumer. That's the view of the general population consumer. And what we can do then is look at our own performance and sort of benchmark how we're pulling people in against what we're seeing among the general population. And that's where it can be so useful because you can make your own inferences about whether or not you've got the consumers you're really targeting, or if you're missing some high spend consumers, or if you're over indexed on low spend consumers. It allows you to contextualize all of that in a much richer way rather than just looking at what's going on among your customer lifetime value.
On a side note, do you think that it's legitimate to do these kinds, legitimate for lack of a better way of putting it, if we're doing these kinds of ongoing tracker surveys as opposed to traditional longitudinal studies? In other words, is there legitimacy if you're not surveying the exact same set of people on an ongoing basis like you would in traditional market research?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the perfect is the enemy of the good. And in a perfect world, yes, we would all be able to have perfect random selection of hundreds of thousands of people and have a perfect panel of them over time forever with nobody dropping out and nobody misremembering things, and that would be great. But nobody actually has that at their disposal. You can form panels. Again, if you are doing this from the sort of the signals intelligence approach, where you are trying to gather as much information as possible and triangulate what the truth is, then being able to put a longitudinal study in there would be great. But in the event that you can't, you still have a population of people, and you can still, if you're doing proper random selection, get a sense of how things change over time. And that can be, I think, just as powerful in the right hands.
Okay. Can you also use market research, this kind of on-demand, real-time market research that we've been talking about, to project increases in customer lifetime value for new business opportunities? In other words, to try and rank in terms of size of opportunity? Or is that kind of a view not as helpful from your point of view?
Yeah, I think you can do that. And I think there's two scenarios where it's particularly useful. The first would be if you're a brand new company and you don't have what 3-year tenure looks like because you've only been around for 6 months, then you can try and get at that by looking at what consumers in the marketplace tend to do. The other scenario, if you're an existing company and you do have that sense of it, is what we were just talking about in terms of benchmarking the performance that you've seen against what the performance in the marketplace is, to get a sense of saying, we're getting this much customer lifetime value out of people, but what we're seeing from the general population is that they could spend more time in terms of tenure with a company if X, Y, and Z were if they were satisfied on X, Y, or Z parameters, and they would also be they're also willing to spend more if 1, 2, and 3 parameters are met, right? And so from there you could say, okay, well, if we can capture more of those people, we could drive up customer lifetime value in the future because we know that we can get both that tenure and that spend value to go up.
Okay. So as you and I talked before, we started thinking about some sample questions that we could field so that we could give the audience for this webinar a sense for the kinds of questions that we might ask that could help better inform and customer lifetime value and keep its calculations more real time, its values more real time. So I'm going to share the results of the survey that we ran here, and so I believe those of you on our webinar audience should be able to see this at this point. And what we have here is the Pollfish final results summary. Of course, you can see here that we just launched it yesterday, and it completed within a matter of hours. And you can see the breakdown from basic demographics to more detailed demographics, and so you can target based on that. 57% male response, which I think is very healthy, balanced response, since it can always skew one way or another, right? The one thing that I wanted to note here is that we asked, one of the screening questions we asked is whether or not the respondent was a current homeowner, and 63.5% of them said that they were. How does that compare to the results that you've published, Mischa?
That's pretty consistent. One of the first steps we always do is benchmark against what we really know. So in this case, looking at this survey that you had just run on the Pollfish side, we know that the general population home ownership rate is about, I think it's around 65% this quarter. And so we know that we're already dialing into a pretty close perspective, right? We're pretty close in terms of where people are in the general population. So already right there, we know that even on this quick survey that was run without spending a bunch of time on targeting or demographic weights or any of those things, we already got a figure that's pretty tight within the general population figures. So right there, it's just sort of a nice, we're very much in the ballpark of where we need to be, and then we can hone and weight things proportionally after that.
That's always a good place to start, right?
Yep.
The next question we asked, or the first question we asked after that screening question, was whether or not people were planning on selling their home in the next 6 months. And it looks like the majority of them, the respondents, we collected 400 responses, said that they definitely were. So again, using this as a reality check, how does this compare to the reports that Angi has been putting out?
So that's an interesting one because we haven't put out figures specifically looking at whether or not people are planning on selling in their next 6 months. We haven't put anything exactly on this front, but that's one where I look at it and I think we'd want to dial deeper into what the intent really means, because that right now home prices are very, very they've shot up, right? The Case-Shiller numbers just came out on Wednesday, tracking home prices, and it's the highest year-over-year home price growth, controlling for quality of home, in the history of the series, if I remember correctly. And so that's one of those ones where we expect more people are now starting to look at it. Now, do I think a quarter of the population is actually going to sell their homes in the next 6 months? I don't. So that's one of those ones where we want to sort of dial into what the intent really is and sort of benchmark it against which group of respondents are really driving that up, and do we need to weight it proportionally? But I certainly think it's picking up on the accurate sentiment that a lot of the population is saying, hey, I've just gained hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity in my home. Should I consider switching? Do I have more flexibility at work that I can cash out on this and go buy something else and sort of bank the difference? And so I think that's where it's picking up on.
Right. Question 3 later on there, we skipping one, said that 67, rounding up 68% of respondents felt that their home value would increase. And so I think that makes perfect sense and is completely logical compared to vis-a-vis the comments that you were just making. So going back then, this is something that you guys, that Angi probably has more directly hit on. We went through and we created, although we could have created ranges for this question, we just did it as an open-ended numeric value and asked people how much they think they'd be spending on home improvements or repairs over the next 6 months. It looks like here the highest value, the highest number of responses came somewhere around the $1,000 range, or it was the value that they put in. Do you have any comments as to how that data sits compared to the information that you guys have been, and the research and reports that you guys have put out?
Yeah, so we have not begun our look this year at what consumers are doing. That's coming up pretty soon, actually. But we do, whenever possible, love to ask these open-ended questions for a couple of reasons. First is, with every single panel that one constructs, you're always going to get a little bit of noise where people give answers that are that they're rushing through, or they're thinking on, and they don't feel comfortable disclosing. And I like the open-ended because it allows us to sort of track those down easier. If you bucket them and people just select a bucket at random, it distorts your confidence in the results because you don't know that somebody's done that. Whereas with the open-ended, if somebody says, minus $8 trillion, you can say, okay, well, that's not a serious answer. I can exclude that. But the other thing that it does is it allows you to get a sense of how people think about it, right? People who say that they expect to spend $1,000 won't. They'll spend something around that, but it'll be more or less. People tend to think in round numbers. And so when you're doing that, it's a couple things. One, it gives you insight into how people think about it, and that can be helpful for your own marketing or communications. But it also gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you shift that around. It tells you what buckets people tend to think of. And then if you want to smooth out the distribution, there are statistical methods you can use, like weighted binned medians, which allow you to say, okay, I've got this cluster of answers around 10,000. I want to sort of spread those out a little bit to get a clearer sense of what the distribution could look like around there. But in terms of how much people think they're going to spend on home improvements or repairs, this is one of those ones that even with the noise, with just the raw data, even without those corrections, just asking that over time, as long as your sample size is large enough, can give you a good sense of how people's expectations are moving, even if there's noise in the data that you haven't cleaned up.
If you don't mind the question, as long as we're on the subject of a valid statistical sample, this survey was run collecting 400 responses. Is there a general number that you think about when you think about the number of valid responses to help you decide what to do?
It really depends on the use case. I think, there is not a good rule of thumb. Sometimes people like to say, oh, you need a minimum of 30 respondents on a quick answer. That's a heuristic, but it's, a statistical purist would probably lecture you if you propose that as a good rule of thumb. But, within healthcare and nutrition science, sample sizes of 30 are actually not that uncommon. We really sort of shifted around based on what the use case is. If it's something internal where we're trying to get a quick look at something, we'll go with a smaller sample size. If you are expecting to be out there in terms of what the top tier press will cover, if you want to get those citations in the leading news organizations, you're going to need to have a pretty robust sample size, probably at least 12 to 1,500 in terms of getting out there and saying, hey, these results are real. And then it kind of depends on what else. If you want to really cross-tabulate something a whole bunch of times, you might need to get into the many multiples of thousands if you want to have good cross-tabulated numbers. After you sort of slice and dice your data by 3 different angles, you might end up with pretty small observation sets unless you have a lot of starting observations. So then you'd need a lot more people. But the other thing is not just the sample size. One should really think about, too, what the composition of that sample is. Are you pulling in the people that you want to pull in?
Right. It always comes down to how well you targeted and define your sample, right?
Right. Exactly.
So assuming that you've done the targeting correctly and you come up with results that are significantly different than your current assumption, what would your next steps be in terms of what you would do with that observation?
That is a very, very open-ended, sort of broad answer in terms of what happens. It really comes down to what the question is and how much it's fitting with your expectations. Sometimes you might get a result that doesn't fit with your expectations because your expectations are wrong. Other times you might not get the result you expect because there's something that's going on in how you're seeking the information and the result is potentially wrong. So it really comes down to the use case. Sorry, say again.
I was just going to say there's a blind spot that you're not aware of.
Right, exactly. So it could be a blind spot you're not aware of. It could be that something changed that you weren't monitoring, or it could be that the result really is incorrect because people are misinterpreting the question or they don't feel comfortable answering it. It really comes down to the specific use case in the question. And that's really where experience and wisdom and judgment and sort of the art of this stuff comes into play rather than the strict science, because you really have to take each set of results on a case-by-case basis when you're looking at it.
Right. And then just for yucks and grins, not that Angi is going to go into boat care and boat maintenance or anything, but we did ask a bunch of people, the 400 respondents, whether or not they own a boat or they're planning on buying one. Is something like this, going back to the question we had before in terms of increasing customer lifetime value, do you see something like this as a legitimate way of framing a potential business opportunity?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. In case of these results, I would do something like look at where the samples are coming in, right? I mean, if I'm seeing 70% of respondents in Manhattan saying they own a boat, I'm going to be a little skeptical. If I'm seeing that in Florida or the Midwest or a place where boating culture is the norm, then that would be pretty consistent with what one would expect. So first is always benchmark it against where your responses are coming in from and the age group, right? If it's a bunch of 19-year-olds saying this, you should be more skeptical than if it's 40-year-olds who have more discretionary income and more sort of accumulated wealth. Mm-hmm. But you could, and this is a perfect example of where you can go up there and get a sense of what people are planning, what they already have, and then infer whether or not you think that market is over or under penetrated and whether or not there's an opportunity for your business there.
Sure. That makes perfect sense. And this was meant for illustrative purposes, just to give people a sense for the kind of questions that one might ask. Are there things here that if you were going to actually pursue this and flesh this out in earnest, are there any responses here that you'd follow up on and want to dig deeper into?
The first thing I always do is I look at that cross-tabulation of what's driving the results. Are you getting uniform results across ages? Are you getting different results? Certain things should be uniform, certain things shouldn't be. And so that's one of those ones that you really want to benchmark. But I'd say for the audience, actually, the main thing I'd like to highlight is the runtime on this. What was the total runtime on gathering these 400 responses?
I don't have the exact numbers, but it was under 2.5 hours, I believe.
And that really highlights the strength of a platform like Pollfish, because you can get insights very, very rapidly. You don't have to wait months for them. You can do something in as little as a few hours. And always with everything, you want to do your polishing and analysis afterwards to dive into things a little deeper. But the overall approach is it's just such a powerful tool to just have at your disposal.
Right. So quality, I know, in market research is always an ongoing concern, just like security. So just as a parallel, it's one of those things where you never cross the finish line, right? It's you hope to eliminate any vulnerabilities in security, and you hope to eliminate any misleading answers or less than thoughtful responses, but it isn't always completely feasible to get there. What are the things that you look for when you are considering options and tools from a market research standpoint to try and ensure that you get the best quality response as quickly as possible?
The first thing is just proper prep work to try and avoid those things from the get-go. We've come up with a couple of strategies, which I won't share with the audience because they're part of our secret sauce, at making sure that we're setting things up from the get-go. And so it's going to be different based on your own approach, how you do this, but proper planning can avoid a lot of the first round sort of issues you might run into. Then after that, you want to make sure that you are, depending on the use case of your data, some things aren't sensitive to a couple of bad responses. Some things can be, depends on how you do it. One of our market research reports, we use a machine learning model, and this is some of the data that feeds into it. And those can be very, very susceptible to bad inputs. And so in that case, we really check every single response to make sure that we have confidence in it and that it makes sense and it's internally consistent. So you can make sure, A, are the responses you're getting consistent with other responses, and B, are they internally consistent with themselves? So if somebody is saying one thing and then a completely contradictory thing later on, you need to take a second look at that and gauge whether or not it is consistent, you just hadn't thought of how it could be consistent, or B, is it that this person doesn't feel comfortable with one of the answers, or C, is it somebody who rushed through it and wasn't serious? And so you always have to take these things into consideration when you're doing it.
Sure. Thank you for that. Any closing comments on the straw dog kind of survey that we put out there and how it might be applied to customer lifetime value?
Sure. I mean, it gives people a sense of what consumers are thinking right now. If you're running that, straw dog quick survey, if you're running that every month and you see it starting to trend up and you've got faith in that, then that can inform the value, right? Because if you could be asking about spending, or you could be asking about tenure expectations or values and priorities. And all of those things can feed into how you forecast out customer lifetime value, rather than thinking strictly about this retrospective view where you're only factoring in your own retrospective look of just empirically what you observed versus what's going on in the marketplace and how it's changing. It allows you to see those things potentially years before they would manifest themselves in your customer lifetime value metric.
Okay, so we had a quick question coming in from Brock Martin, and he wanted to know if quotas were applied for gender and age, and the answer was no. The only screening question that we had, or screening criteria we had, was in the screening question around home ownership. This was meant to be a straw dog. Let's just see what kind of responses we got. Interestingly enough, from what we saw there, we saw a pretty representative Gen Pop representative distribution in terms of age and gender. A little surprising on the number of male responses because we tend to, in market research, you often see more female responses. But in this case, we saw more male responses. But other than that, no, it was just an open-ended, no filters applied except for that screening question.
And then I'll throw in one answer to Brock too, as just sort of something to check. you want to be really intentional about your quotas. One of the things I enjoy about Pollfish is it allows us to do that. If you're polling the construction sector, for example, you don't want a 50-50 split because the construction sector is about 82% male. So in that case, if you're polling that, if you're benchmarking against gender rather than other, you can benchmark on anything. But if that's what you're benchmarking on, you want to make sure that your sample is proportional to what you're benchmarking out there. And that can be true, right? Certain markets don't skew 50-50. Like the markets for certain goods and services skew one way or the other. And in that sense, you also want to make sure you're being intentional about who you're polling.
It's one of those little secrets that you pick up from the experience of someone like you, right? And knowing how to target people, how to target your audiences appropriately.
Oh.
So I think that we are coming up on time. I'm not seeing any additional open questions here. Thank you so much, Mischa. We have included for the audience a link to the reports, the 4 annual reports that Angi produces. We'll also share, of course, your website and all your social media addresses and all that good stuff, as well as Pollfish's. The recording for this webinar will be available with the next 24 to 48 hours, and we'll be sharing that. So please be sure to follow Pollfish on social media or check our website, and we will make sure that that goes out. And of course, we'll send an email notification out to everyone who registered. So with that, Mischa, again, thank you. Any final concluding remarks that you'd like to offer?
No, this was wonderful. Thanks for the good conversation. Hopefully it was useful to the audience. People can feel free to track me down on LinkedIn if they've got any additional questions. I'm usually pretty responsive, given depending on what's going on that day. But happy to be a resource for folks. And thanks again for having such a wonderful platform for the rest of us to use.
Well, thank you for that generous offer. I'm sure that many people will be taking advantage of that. And thank you for your time.
My pleasure.